How do people of conflicting worldviews, memories, and future visions encounter each other? And what role do social identity categories play in these encounters? My name is Parinita Shetty, and you're listening to the first episode of the Ether podcast series. Over the course of different episodes, we're going to explore what it means to encounter difference across diverse spaces of social life. We'll listen to conversations among academics, artists, public commentators, and educators. This is all part of an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project called Ethics and Aesthetics of Encountering the Other, or ETHER as we like to call it. Here's Maggie Kubaniova, Professor of Language Education at the University of Leeds and the Principal Investigator on ETHER.
Ether is a global network of researchers, arts practitioners, and educators whose interests circle around a core question: what does it mean to live our lives in the world of diverse others? And in essence, how should our institutions, communities, and public spaces enable such encounters? As advertised on our project website, the questions are, of course, rooted in contemporary challenges of conflict, polarization, and injustice. But although these challenges around the globe might feel uniquely now, the impulse to exclude, to judge, to impose my way is perhaps a perennial one across diverse human societies and histories. So, what we're doing in Ether is building a theory of encounters with difference with a very practical purpose to help us not so much to address conflict, division, and polarization, but to seek ways of being with one another that can counter such impulses and perhaps engage with them productively even before they become serious threats to social life that they have become in many specific contexts that we personally face and know. Ether does this theory building primarily through listening. In fact, I think that's what Ether is actively doing, learning the art of hearing and seeing the other. So, what you see in our output so far is perhaps a little different from typical research outputs. It is a track record of our collective listening to one another, the process which is ongoing, always humbling, and ever expanding.
Our first podcast series comes from Ether Seminar 1, which focused on the art of seeing and hearing the other. In the next three episodes, we will look at how productive and unproductive social categories by themselves can be, the ways in which bringing art, cultures, and languages to life provoke encounters with difference, and finally, the political dimensions of such encounters in different spaces. But now, back to today's theme. What do we mean by the other when we speak about encountering the other? Maybe let's break it down a little. What role do social identity categories, like a person's ethnicity, class, gender, religion, and disability, among others, play in meaningful encounters with difference? Can these categories help negotiate differences? To what extent does a meaningful encounter with the other require going beyond such social categories? Lara Stephanie Krauss is an academic assistant in the Institute of African Studies at Leipzig University. Her current research explores Black Lives Matter protest slogans in Germany. She proposes that some of these slogans productively racialize white German bodies, that is, white bodies which are normally not racialized in contemporary Germany.
In encounters in Germany, there are apparatuses at work that constantly measure for blackness, but not for whiteness. So these apparatuses, actually, of which I am a part, actually enact cuts that produce black bodies and German bodies, but not white bodies, because white bodies and German bodies are conflated. So there's no cut being enacted there, only between German bodies and black bodies. So what does that mean for us? Well, I would say that this means that participation in material discursive practices which actually enact cuts that produce white Germans because currently white Germans are not a thing, because they're the thing in inverted commas, white Germans and black Germans, that might actually be our responsibility. So let me get back to the Black Lives Matter slogans and what we can learn from them in this regard, and also with this theoretical lens. So you've met Eileen already. Further on in our interview, we were talking about this slogan, and she started herself talking about all the other slogans, but she didn't really talk about this one. And I said, well, you've ignored this one so far, so let's look at it. And she said, yeah, it was easy for me to ignore that poster, because for me, it's essentially a poster that if we're talking about Black Lives Matter protests, it must and should only be brought and carried by white people, or by people who are read as white. So we can see here in this picture of cutting together a part, there's a cut being enacted here between white people or white bodies who would be the ones forming assemblages with this particular slogan, word body assemblages, enact a cut between them and black bodies within the Black Lives Matter movement. But then she immediately goes on to say, well, I would love to take the poster with me if I went to a protest against trans or homophobia, for example. So say I go somewhere where I stand in for trans rights, then I can put myself in those shoes and take on the perspective that maybe a white person would have at a Black Lives Matter protest. So this I find really interesting, because not only does that show that a different word body assemblage in a different protest would produce a heterosexual body that shows solidarity with transgender people, for example. But what is more important for my purposes here, it also, while first it does cut apart white and black bodies, or white and black Germans in this case, it also connects them in a way that she now says, well, this would also make it possible for me to take on the perspective that maybe a white person would have at a Black Lives Matter protest. So these assemblages, these word body assemblages, also open up new possibilities of then again making relations, identifying with each other.
As Lara describes, otherness is contextual, and some social categories become more relevant in specific environments. One of Lara's interview participants, a black German woman, talked about how, in the context of a Black Lives Matter protest, she remains a cultural insider. But when she travels to a trans rights protest, she becomes a cultural outsider who has to work to understand experiences which don't mirror her own. This definitely resonates with me. I am currently an immigrant in the UK, where I have suddenly become racialized. But back home in India, my racial identity is irrelevant, whereas my religious background and caste provides me with significant cultural, social, and political privileges, which goes to show that people can be marginalized or privileged in different settings. Lara's contribution to the seminar is just one of many, all of which explore themes of diversity and otherness in a range of academic, public, and artistic spaces and contexts. These included museums and music performances, stories and poetry, schools and churches, books and media, arts festivals and fan podcasts, academic research projects, and social justice protests. As a researcher and as a writer who works with young people, I'm really interested in the different ways in which learning occurs in informal spaces outside schools. The public pedagogy scholars Ruben A. Gastambide Fernandez and Alexandra Araiz Matute don't think that the spaces themselves are as important as people's interactions within them. They believe that it's only when people come together in order to challenge and expand each other's perspectives and learn from different experiences that change occurs. Lara described an instance of this happening in protest spaces, but the Ether seminar itself, in a way, provided a space for such interactions or encounters with difference, which sparked a variety of conversations. People's diverse social categories have different impacts depending on the spaces they travel through. Linguist Suresh Kannagaraja uses the term strategic constructivism to describe how people from marginalized backgrounds deliberately and strategically use their identities to resist the oppressive dominant structures they inhabit. Dagmar Dyke is a Pacifica artist, social justice activist, and art educator in New Zealand. She is also a first generation New Zealander born to immigrant parents. When it came to Dagmar, her social category, her difference, plays a fundamental role in her art, storytelling, and
Kia
the
ora
ways in
koutou
which she
katoa.
navigates the
Ki
world.
te taha o tōku māma. Ko te lau te maunga, ko utunake te hapu, ko Wolfgram ko hemoloto o ko whānau no tonga ahau. Ki te taha o tōku pāpā, ko Feldberg te maunga, ko Arzen te hapu, ko Dyke ko kuhta o ko whānau, ko Hamene ahau. Engare, I whānu mai ahau ki Aotearoa I raki pai whenua. E noho ana au ki Maungarei, ko Dagmar Dyke toko ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I am a first generation New Zealander living and working in our largest city, Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My mother is German Tongan from Vava'o, and my father is German Polish Dutch. My entire life I have felt my difference. I look different to the dominant culture. My name Dagmar Dyke sounds different. My parents speak different languages. Our family traditions are different. Being different is part of the framework of my identity. In our Sea of Islands, Tongan scholar Epeli Hauofa writes, "Whatever we produce must not be a version of our existing reality, which is largely a creation of imperialism. It must be different and of our own making. We should not forget that human reality is human creation. If we fail to create our own, someone else will do it for us by default." Hauofa believed in an individual's right to be custodians of their own knowledge and identity, so that their realities are not only learned and understood, but also shared. Thank you, Ether, for providing this virtual VAR, or space, to offer my personal experiences framed by 3 guiding questions. Question 1. How does being different and add value and meaning to your work? As a Pacifica artist, social justice activist, and art educator, I believe the arts and storytelling are powerful levers for those like myself, where being different are our lived experiences. Arts and storytelling are interlinked in the way that we, as Pacific peoples, create our arts and provide the va or spaces in which we tell them. My difference plays a fundamental role in the way I navigate my world. Throughout my schooling years, I never had a teacher or lecturer who reflected me, nor did I have conversations with teachers about my exact identity, an experience that made me feel culturally invisible. However, through deliberate actions of my art teachers, they recognised the creative capacity in me. They encouraged me to use my art as a platform and vehicle to tell my story. The rest is history.
Both in her provocation and during our panel conversation in the Ether seminar, Dagmar elaborated on the inequalities which underpin the New Zealand education system and emphasized why the students' social categories need to be at the forefront of any potential solutions.
What strategies in visual arts education can we use to meet the current inequities within our education system? Firstly, the potential for culturally sustaining pedagogies in visual arts education. The underpinning idea supporting the ethos of culturally sustaining pedagogies is the recognition of social and educational inequality. The call for teachers to be culturally responsive is a popular discourse that regularly appears in attempts to address inequitable outcomes in education for minority groups. New Zealand's education system has generally remained silent on the topic of whiteness, white privilege, and supremacy, and the Eurocentric nature of our schooling policy and practice. Relevant to New Zealand-born Pacific students and families is the acknowledgement of language and culture loss as a result of colonisation. While the disappearance of this cultural capital is evident, Visual arts presents the possibility for reimagining schools through approaches that validate Pasifika perspectives.
I think the New Zealand context I was trying to get a sense of for everyone to understand here is that we have our Indigenous people Māori, and so Māori we need to place first in terms of as because that is their right to be. I'm a Pacifica person. I'm of Tongan and German descent, but we sit when we look at our educational outcomes here in New Zealand. Māori and Pacific children are the ones that achieve. They're the most students that don't achieve very well here. So we've got a lot of work to do in that space because we've got a dominant education system here that's set up for the Pākehā or the white person, the European. It's been founded like that. So we've got a lot of work to do in that space.
What I found really interesting was how people in different contexts use traditional markers of their social categories to begin conversations with others. These conversations then go on to present a much more complex and nuanced picture of their identities. Adam Jaffar is the curator of world cultures for Leeds Museums and Galleries. He titled his contribution, Where's the Art for White People? Because he noticed it was a theme in question which kept cropping up whenever there were museum exhibits of non-Western and non-white cultures. Adam describes how a seemingly innocuous activity in a museum becomes a way to discover and learn about another community in ways which go beyond the picture painted by mainstream narratives.
I also feel that it inspires curiosity amongst the other visitors as well, if they feel that they can ask people questions. As I say, we do tend to do displays in museums. We have artists come in and do residencies. And I would say it's just as well as seeing the art being made, it's important for visitors to be able to talk to the artists and ask them questions about who they are and what they do. The kind of the one that sticks out to me from my point of view is we had the Sikh Education Council come to a venue where I used to work, and they did turban tying on the public. So it's a bit like having your hair cut. You kind of sit down and you get your hair cut. So you get your kind of turban tied. But the first aim would be to kind of learn what a turban is, what it feels like, and why it's worn. But the more subtle kind of interaction was that people felt comfortable to ask the person tying their turban what it's like and kind of get their experiences. And those aren't the kinds of things that you can put across in a graphic panel as a non-Sikh curator, for example.
Thanda Gumede is a musician from South Africa who is now based in England. He innovatively and deliberately uses aspects of his culture as an educational intervention. On the one hand, he visits schools in the UK where he wears traditional Zulu clothes and sings Zulu music to teach British students about his heritage. At the same time, he also uses these visits as an opportunity to create counter-narratives against stereotypical images about African people, which the students may have encountered.
For me, for instance, music and education are interchangeable. As a person of Zulu and Xhosa heritage, our history was not recorded down, but it was actually orally relayed and transmitted from the older generation to the younger generation through music and through poetry, etc. So there is a lot in our music that ensures that there is education, there is language, there is culture. When I reached the United Kingdom, I started my own company called Zulu Tradition that began to tour around the United Kingdom, but it also had a program for schools. Education was a huge and integral part in everything that we were doing. So for instance, if we did a showcase, we would perform for people, but we also had to deconstruct what we did and be able to explain and expand the significance of the music that we were doing to our culture.
Now, here's Thanda in conversation with Cornelia Bock, fellow Ether participant and a PhD researcher from the University of Hamburg.
with reference to the school programs that you mentioned. How did you go about like engaging the students and help them understand what's going on?
With regards to the schools and the kids, this one is quite simple. So when we tour with Zulu tradition, that is basically me with a group of other Zulus, maybe 6, 10, depending on the event, dressed in traditional Zulu regalia. And what would happen is we would go to different schools across the United Kingdom. We would perform. We are just performing for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But afterwards, we then perform and then explain what we are wearing. So this is a contemporary African thing, but that one includes like umqhele, which is the Zulu crown. It will include imbata, the covering. I would say the reason I'm wearing this is because I reached that age, I would have been topless. So it's a different kind of culture, etc. And so when they see what we are wearing and explain what the colors mean, they then come on stage to sort of join us, because we wanted that exchange. We also speak about that Africa is not just a tree with just giraffes and lions around. You know, they need to understand the contemporary aspects of that. So in conclusion, we feel that education is part of everything that we do, because in Zulu culture, we have a thing called ukutamundwa. That means the information was orally relayed. So we had to memorize songs. One of the things I mentioned in the video is that my last name is Gumede. We don't have ancestry.com. We don't have things written down to say this is your ancestral tree or whatnot. So I have to memorize a poem. Gumede, Kwabe, Yeye, Mguni. Those are the names of my forefathers before me. So if somebody else sings their poem and there is a line that is similar to mine, it means I cannot marry that person. We cannot date with that person. So this is why music and poetry and dance is important. When they were teaching me to dance, I thought I was doing a dance, only to find that they were teaching me to defend myself. So those things, the subliminal education is embedded in the music, in the poetry, in the drawings, in the art. So that is why when we go into schools, we are like, hey, music cannot be distinguished from education. So we sing and then we explain.
Theo Pittman is a professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Leeds. Her contribution talks about an art exhibition in Brazil which brought together indigenous and non-indigenous people. The following extract comes from Thea's research video, which was a part of a provocation for Ether. In it, some of the artists speak about how their identities as indigenous people helped them have conversations with non-indigenous museum visitors in ways which challenged stereotypes about their cultures. One of the artists believed that people wouldn't recognize them as indigenous if they didn't dress up in their traditional clothes. So, these traditional markers of their identities became instrumental in subverting tropes and expanding imaginations.
Misturando os eletrônicos com a cultura, com o espiritual, os antigos, artesanato, e para a sociedade entender como é que é o ser índio nos tempos de hoje. E eu sentir pessoas com medo de chegar e depois que topa e conversa, aí sente uma outra coisa.
Uma ocupação cultural, que hoje nós somos reconhecidos como indígenas, mas pela cultura. Se nós está sem cultura, nós não temos reconhecimento como indígena. Eu estou vestida na minha Austrália, usando a minha cultura indígena, muitas pessoas vão ver que eu sou indígena, vão ter a curiosidade de me perguntar.
Mas eu estou aqui, dando a minha cara tapa hoje, dando a minha cara, a minha força, para falar o que é indígena, para falar quem eu sou. E eu não tenho medo de falar quem eu sou. Eu sou Manguechai e vim aqui para dizer para vocês que eu sou um indígena e quero lutar pelos meus direitos.
Até eu disse para os meus colegas, meus irmãos, meus parentes da comunidade, eu disse para ele que nós estávamos se preparando para fazermos uma retomada perante a humana, mostrando a nossa sabedoria, a nossa inteligência.
People's social categories can also become a way to discuss topics which aren't always explored in mainstream discourse. Helen Finch is an associate professor in German at the University of Leeds. By focusing on the literature written by survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, Helen's contribution studies whether encounters between German speaking survivors of extreme violence and other members of the German community can be meaningful given the power imbalance which results from such violence. She discusses how Jewish survivors use literature to stage fantasy encounters with fellow Germans, to explore uncomfortable emotions, and to reclaim those cultural aspects which the violence excluded them from.
I'm speaking particularly in reference to my research on the literature written by German Jewish survivors of the Shoah or the Holocaust, the mass murder of European Jews at the hands of Nazis and other associated allies in the middle of the 20th century. This research encompasses a number of questions very germane to this project, particularly looking at life writing in the aftermath of trauma. The writers that I am looking at encountered violence at the hands of the Nazis because of being othered as Jewish, and yet they were people who shared a culture with their German persecutors. They shared a language with their persecutors. Often they reflected on the fact that they knew their persecutors intimately as friends. So my questions that I'm bringing to this provocation are asking, well, how can somebody who has been othered by a majority culture, who has experienced extreme violence at the hands of that culture, still encounter members of that dominant culture within their own shared language? How can, to put it more specifically, how can a German survivor, somebody who was born in the German lands, write in German to a German-speaking audience about their history of pain and suffering? How can they make a German audience who in the 1950s and 1960s often wanted nothing more than to say that the past was over and done with, to say that enough compensation had been given to people who had suffered persecution, who wanted their literature to reflect an optimistic sense of moving forward from the past? How could these writers find an audience? What role did their literature have in staging this encounter between Germans and Jews that would acknowledge, on the one hand, the shared culture, but on the other, the radical different experience that German Jews had of the period of Nazi persecution? There are lots and lots of questions that emerge from this. The practical questions of what German publisher is going to publish this material that often accuses the German public of crimes and attitudes that it would rather forget. Such works might find a publishing house in other parts of the world, but when the people being accused of, for example, culturally persecuting Jews are the people who are publishing the literature, how does that encounter play itself out? In fact, in many of the literary texts that I'm looking at, this encounter is fictionalized and restaged over and over again. The German survivor attempts to publish their work and yet it is rejected. Or in other fictionalized accounts, the German survivor attempts to testify to in the German language to a fellow German, only to find their witness ignored or in some way rejected, misunderstood, overheard, patronised, or dismissed as being over-emotional, untimely. The encounter takes place, but the encounter is trivialised and is not allowed to have the impact that the survivor wishes it to have. It does not carry with it the hope of genuine societal change.
Here's Lara Krauss again, responding to Helen's provocation.
You're using also in your title and in your research this idea of the same other. And in your talk, you already talk about language as what I would think is some of that, what constitutes the sameness in your concept. But I still wanted to ask first, like, how do you operationalize that concept? So what is part of the sameness in the other, that how you're using
This
it?
is a question of sameness. It's about a cultural claim on the part of survivors of saying, the act of violence cast me out of the community, and during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, obviously there was an extreme example of excluding people and putting into what Agamben calls the zone of exception, dehumanizing people, expelling them from the community of humanity, never mind the community of the nation. And the people that I'm writing about make the claim to sameness and say, no, I have equal dignity and I have an equal claim to this culture. So that's about equality rather than, and also saying, this is my identity too. You've tried to steal it and take the language that I speak and make it do violent acts, but I'm going to have a claim to that language. I'm going to have a claim to write literature in that language in the way that I see fit. And that might be drawing on traditions that are Jewish and have not been acceptable in this language, or it might be drawing on traditions which are traditionally seen as German and say, no, they belong to me as well. So it's an act of reclamation, the sameness.
In the same vein as Helen's contribution to the seminar, my provocation also explored how people use a fictional framework to discuss potentially contentious real-world experiences and perspectives. In my research of media fans, I found that many fans from marginalized groups foreground their social categories as they discuss fictional representations. By critiquing misrepresentations or the erasure of their identities in some of their favorite media, disabled fans, queer fans, and religious fans, among others, talk back to existing media and social structures. Here, both mainstream media supplemented by fan-authored media becomes a way to highlight how existing structures uphold inequalities. Robert, one of my co-participants in my PhD project, discussed how in mainstream science fiction and fantasy media, magic or advanced technology is often used to fix and thereby erase disabilities. It's rarely used to imagine creative ways for disabled bodies and minds to navigate these worlds. He was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that his disabled mind and body don't belong even in most people's imaginary worlds. As he said, it comes back to the idea of always being told that a progressed world is a world which has eradicated you. Such conversations can act as consciousness raisers and enable a collective process of decolonization as people from both marginalized and dominant cultures become aware of issues they may not have previously considered. However, one of the downsides of strategically employing social categories in this way is that people from marginalized groups are saddled with the burden of constantly having to explain themselves, since the default in mainstream media and society rarely includes their experiences and perspectives. For example, Robert found it difficult to explain what it's like to live with a disability because he's never experienced anything else. He's always had dyspraxia and he's always been on the autistic spectrum. He didn't know how his experiences differed from other people's lives. Primarily relying on social categories can also mean that certain monolithic expectations and assumptions become fixed in people's minds, which leave little room for multiple experiences and identities. In South Africa, Thanda's work focused on contemporary and American gospel music, whereas in the UK, he has almost exclusively focused on traditional warrior song and dance compilations which draw on his Zulu and Xhosa heritage. During the seminar, Thanda described his struggles with his contextually situated categories and how people's expectations differed based on where he was and which identity he inhabited. When he was in South Africa, he was expected to sound American without a trace of his own accent. But in the UK, he was expected to perform his Zulu and Xhosa identities which were often restricted to occasions like Black History Month. Latest research in interactional sociolinguistics and multilingualism suggests that when it comes to thinking about diversity, it's important to remember that people's identities aren't limited to specific elements based on their race, language, or geographic origin. Instead, people creatively draw from multiple practices and interests as they construct new identities which transcend traditional assumptions. Another limitation of relying on social categories is that some people are excluded because a specific group becomes the norm. As Lara previously explored in a German context, whiteness isn't racialized. Only black bodies are. White bodies and German bodies become conflated. As she pointed out, currently white Germans aren't a thing because they are the thing. This theme also came up in a conversation between Lara and Helen during our seminar. Here they are again.
And I think my second question would be, because at the very end, you sort of make the swing where you say, okay, let's also look at colonial and post-colonial history of contemporary Germany, which is where I think our things also really come together in a sense. And what I've seen in my research that also a lot of Black Germans are frustrated that it's always about the Holocaust and it's always about that part of the German past. So sort of the concerns of racialization of, if I may say, others are silenced by this overwhelming genocidal history, which is not the only genocide that Germany has perpetrated, but the one against Black bodies is not really spoken about. So I was just wondering if you see any possibility of bringing together the force of these two debates or part of history in order to sort of effect change and not always have this, this is overshadowing us and we have different issues, but sort of maybe to think it together and what literature could do in that context.
And I think your final question is so interesting because I think this is exactly what the memory theatre, which is a term used by a great young theorist called Max Czarek, is all about. This idea of a public performance with a predetermined outcome and a limited range of players who have a limited range of options that they can play. And I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of multidirectionality, which comes from an American theorist, Michael Rothberg. His book, Multidirectional Memory, has just been translated into German, and it's got a lot of controversy there. And his idea is that memory of suffering can be used to build community between excluded groups. So rather than the memory theatre, which sees excluded groups or minoritized groups somehow battling for attention in the public view, that comes back to what Sophie was talking about, the value of attention. It's about building solidarity between those groups, seeing the commonalities and also the historical continuities between, for example, what happened in German Southwest Africa and what happened later in Europe, and using those communities to productively build solidarity that doesn't always have to be mediated via the white community.
This idea of solidarity is one I'm particularly interested in. Ruben A. Gastambide Fernandez and Alexandra Araiz Matute believe that a commitment to solidarity is necessary when it comes to spaces which include people who may have multiple perspectives and different priorities. Several scholars and activists think that it's important to centralize radical differences rather than aim for universality when it comes to developing solidarity amongst diverse groups of people. Suresh Kannagaraja points out that for many people from marginalized groups, their differences can be an important part of their identities. Differences they're unwilling to let go of in order to assimilate into the dominant culture's norms and structures. He doesn't think that people need to leave their differences at the door when it comes to building relationships with others. At the same time, he believes it's important to be open to other people's differences as well as you interact with them. He thinks that such an orientation towards understanding diverse worldviews can help people understand themselves as well as others. One of the themes which came up repeatedly in the different provocations and conversations was that engaging with differences requires an active effort and an ethical orientation so that certain assumptions aren't uncritically taken for granted. Suresh Kannagaraja again calls this process of deliberate interaction and mutual collaboration dialogical cosmopolitanism. In this case, imbalanced power hierarchies are recognized and they're addressed so that no one group's values and interests dominate. Ruben A. Gastambide Fernandez says, it is about imagining human relations that are premised on the relationship between difference and interdependency, rather than similarity and a rational calculation of self-interests. Writer and activist Audre Lorde agrees with the assertion that people should work together to co-create shared meanings and goals while still respecting each other's differences. As she says, you do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. In our seminar, sociolinguist Anna Dumet elaborated on this idea of placing a commitment to difference and collaboration at the heart of solidarity in political projects.
The idea of solidarity, a discussion that resonated very strongly with my own thinking about positionality. I've always found the term ally very problematic. It seems to me to be about the liberal subject, but it misses the deep collective commitment that shapes solidarity. The political scientist Jodie Dean recently suggested that we should rather use the word comrade, and I do like her suggestion. Jodie Dean notes that the word comrade indexes political and affective relations. She writes, no matter their differences, comrades stand together. They are united by a political vision, they dream of a different world, and they actively struggle to achieve this world. A similar vision of solidarity was proposed by Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s and linked discourses of revolution and African liberation. Comrade first appeared as a term in the 16th century when it referred to a person with whom one would share house and food. Here, closeness was not, as implied by Derrida, grounded in a sense of emotional and affective sameness, but grounded in praxis, in doing, and in cohabitation. I like these ideas of solidarity and revolution, where political vision and dreaming allow for connections that are not based on traditional ideas of sameness, but on a common purpose and respect for each other. Linked to this, for me, is also the idea of love for others. We should not be shy to use this word and to liberate it from its romantic connotations. James Baldwin's reflection provides inspiration. Love, for Baldwin, demands psychological and embodied self-transformation. We might not love everyone all the time, but we can engage with others based on a praxis that is informed by love.
Thanks to my own political and philosophical passions, I particularly love discussions about social justice, equality, liberation, and revolution. At the same time, I think it's important to temper this enthusiasm with some considerations. When we talk about social justice, whose society are we talking about? Who is fighting? What are they, what are we fighting for? In thinking about equality, who is this equality for? Who does it include and who does it exclude? These questions go some way in emphasizing the importance of contextualization. Even people working towards a similar goal come from different social, cultural, political, and historical backgrounds. Identities and terminologies don't always mean the same thing in different spaces. It might be more helpful to focus on the process of encountering different social categories rather than the social categories themselves. In this case, identities and ideas can become more contextualized rather than definitively framed in predetermined ways. How do we create counter narratives to the dominant ideas of universality and sameness? How can we encourage an openness to different others? Do our ideologies, both ones which form a core part of our sense of self, as well as ones we've unknowingly internalized, stand the test of the encounter? As tempting as it might be to claim we've solved problems of diversity and inclusion, we don't really have definite answers to these questions. It's something that different Ether participants have explored and continue to investigate through their projects set in different spaces. However, the questions themselves, as well as a lack of clear answers, helps highlight the fact that encountering difference is an ongoing and lifelong process. People's social categories become an entryway to this process rather than an end goal. This is a process which will require several bouts of learning and unlearning. As we encounter new people, new identities, new ideas, and new contexts, this is a process which will never quite be